Good day. Today is Friday, 9th January 2026, and let me remind you before I proceed with this video to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if once you've watched this video you decide that you like what you've heard and wish to indicate this fact. Well, yesterday in my program I discussed how Russian foreign policy appears to be becoming increasingly assertive relative to the United States, and also how it is becoming more assertive altogether. And we had further proof of this, and also a strong military step being taken by the Russians with the second Oreshnik strike, which took place last night near Lvov, a city in western Ukraine, apparently targeting a major energy facility, a gas facility in Ukraine, a gas facility which apparently contains roughly 50% of all natural gas stored in Ukraine. And there are various claims that the gas facility in question not only provides gas for Ukraine itself, but it stores gas for Europe, for European countries, for other European countries, members of the European Union, including Germany. Now, a couple of days ago, I said in another video that the Russian natural gas export monopoly company, Gazprom, has been claiming that gas reserves in Europe are at unusually low levels this time of year. And whilst they didn't suggest that there was a crisis immediately on the horizon in terms of available gas, problems in future gas supply were likely, and the implication was that a further upward shift in gas prices might be coming too. And I discussed how Gazprom's warnings reminded me of the situation in 2021 when, as a result of a cold winter and a very dry summer, gas use in Europe was unusually high, and Europe's decision, which had been long-standing, to transfer gas increasingly from long-term contracts with Gazprom to purchases of gas on the spot market, the shortages and the shortages in the reserves and the new pricing formula taken together led to a sharp increase in gas prices in Europe in the autumn of 2022, the summer and autumn of 2021, and in the early weeks of 2022. So before actually the special military operation began, which of course led as a result of Western sanctions and the closure of the Nord Stream pipelines, to another huge upward shift in European gas prices. But anyway, perhaps the attack by the Oreshnik on this facility is intended by the Russians to make that problem worse. I am not fully sure, because the full details about this strike have not been provided, but there is a video of it, a short video, lasts about a minute, taken by somebody in Ukraine. Of course, we don't know who this person was and why they were filming this attack. It appears to happen in the middle of the night. You see the houses with the snow all around. There is no visible person anywhere. Everything looks quiet and deserted, except you can see in the distance the huge flashes lighting up the night sky, and you can also hear the noise like thunder as the missiles impact. And you also see streaks of light, which perhaps are the missile warheads coming in and hitting the facility as the attack takes place. Well, the Russian Defense Ministry has provided its own account of the strike. It says this: last night, in response to the terrorist attack by the Kiev regime on the residence of the President of the Russian Federation in Novgorod region, launched on the night of 29th December 2025, the Russian armed forces launched a massive strike with high-precision, long-range ground and sea-based weapons, including the Oreshnik mobile ground-based medium-range missile system, as well as attack unmanned aerial drones at critically important facilities on the territory of Ukraine. Now, notice that the Russian Defense Ministry is saying that there was all sorts of other places across Ukraine were attacked as well, and as we will see, that is absolutely the case. And but there was a single Oreshnik strike, and the Defense Ministry continues. All the assigned targets have been hit. Production facilities of unmanned aerial vehicles that were used during the terrorist attack, as well as power infrastructure enterprises that support the defense industry of Ukraine, have been damaged. Any terrorist action by the criminal Ukrainian regime will not remain unanswered in future. So the Russians are linking this attack to the attack on Putin's Valdai residence in back in December. Of course, it's important to say that none of the drones reached the Valdai residence. None of them did any harm. They were all shot down, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, and there is no evidence at all to contradict that claim. And obviously, if this was an assassination attempt on Vladimir Putin, then it was completely unsuccessful. Now, in respect of that attack, there's been lots of muttering and complaints from all sorts of people on the threads to this video, to my videos, in the threads, to other videos and other places, in articles, in comments that appear in Telegram and on X, that the Russians have been again pusillanimous, that they've responded weakly to the attack on Putin's residence in Valdai, and that Russia is weak and easily intimidated, and it's taken no action against the United States, that was no doubt complicit in that attack also. Well, you hear these sort of things being said and all of these criticisms made, and they're made all the time and every day, and this mantra of Russia being weak and of the West being aggressive and strong, and of the Russians never responding to provocations in the way that they should do and allowing their red lines to be crossed. Anyway, it gets endlessly and ceaselessly repeated. Well, there's an awful lot that can be said about this, but let me first of all make one very simple and obvious observation. If it was an assassination attempt on Putin, then it obviously and completely failed. Not a single drone reached the Valdai residence. Not a single drone did any damage to the Valdai residence. And Putin himself, of course, wasn't even in the Valdai residence when the attack took place. He was in the Kremlin. And, of course, it must be said and remembered that the Ukrainians denied vehemently that such an attack took place at all. And Donald Trump and the CIA appear to be saying, or are saying at the moment, the same thing, even though they contradict the Ukrainians and they contradict the articles that were appearing in the European media immediately after the drone attack, by admitting that there was a drone attack the Americans admit that there was a Ukrainian drone attack in Novgorod, except that they say that it wasn't on Putin's Valdai residence. Instead, it was against a certain target whose identity they won't disclose. So we have had one entirely unsuccessful, completely failed attack altogether, one which merely resulted in drones being lost and a certain amount of embarrassment caused. A completely, entirely failed attack. And according to the Russian Foreign Ministry, Lavrov has also said this, and the Russian Defense Ministry, what it has done, is provoke a devastating Russian strike on a gas facility, which the Ukrainians themselves are admitting they have no ability to counter. There is no weapon in the West that can counter the Oreshnik. Even the Americans admit as much. An absolutely devastating attack, which, according to various reports, has quite plausibly destroyed the entire facility in which 50% of Ukraine's gas was stored, and where a proportion of Europe's and Germany's gas was stored as well. This is a reality that these critics who harp on endlessly about Russian weakness never acknowledge. The Ukrainians do conduct attacks on refineries, on tankers. They carried out another attack on another Russian tanker in the Black Sea yesterday. They carry out these attacks, and they are pinpricks, which make absolutely no difference either to the stability of the Russian economy or to the overall performance of the Russian military, and they change absolutely nothing in terms of the Russian progress in the special military operation. The Russians conduct attacks, and their effect is devastating. Now, I singled out the Oreshnik strike, but here perhaps it might be worthwhile saying something about the other attacks that took place across Ukraine yesterday. The Russians launched, according to some reports, up to 20 ballistic missiles. Iskander-Ms launched from the battlefronts against various targets across Ukraine. They also launched a significant number of drones, and the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is invariably and always claimed to have been defeated and destroyed, well, it also launched Kalibra drones that also participated in the attack. 2 Russian frigates, the Admiral Makarov and the Admiral Essen, launched Kalibra missiles, as did the Varshavyanka submarine, which, by the way, and for the record, I believe is the same submarine that the Ukrainians tried to attack about 2 weeks ago in the port of Novorossiysk, and which they claimed that they had damaged and destroyed, with the Russians saying that that was not true. I'm not absolutely certain that it is the same submarine, by the way. To my knowledge, the Russian Black Sea Fleet has 6 submarines. Anyway, there we go. So, huge attack. The biggest, the most striking, the most spectacular part of the attack was the one that used the Oreshnik. But attacks also took place across much of the territory of Ukraine last night. And there are massive power cuts in Dnipro, in the city of Dnipro, one of Ukraine's big industrial hubs. There were massive power shortages in Dnipropetrovsk region. There are massive power shortages in Kiev. the Ukrainian capital. And just before I started making this program, I saw a report that, in fact, it's not a report, I have no doubt that this is true, that the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, has now said that any civilian who can leave Kiev on a temporary basis is strongly advised to do so. It's not yet an order to evacuate Kiev, but it is coming closer and closer to that very point. And we also are getting reports that, I've seen reports that the building of the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, is also now without electric power, and that the water supplies in Kiev are also becoming affected. This in midwinter. Temperatures in Kiev and across Ukraine are apparently have fallen below zero. There's been heavy snowfalls. The situation is absolutely critical. So, a failed attack on a building in which Putin was not even located is held up by some people as proof of Russian weakness. I have to say, in relation to what actually happened last night, I am unable myself to see where there is this evidence of weakness. That's a first point that I absolutely do want to make. Now, the other thing to say is that the Oreshnik is now entering service and is being used in the war. Now, at this point, I will make my own quick observation about the attack last night. I am not even certain, in fact, I actually doubt, that this attack really was carried out as a response to the attack on Putin's Valdai residence. Of course, it suits the Russians to say that it was, but the reality is that the Oreshnik was in production throughout last year. It was deployed with the Russian military in August, and Putin confirmed that it had actually been activated and was ready for use in December. At least 10 Oreshnik missiles have now been deployed in Belarus, according to the Belarus president, Alexander Lukashenko, and we must suppose that there are now others in Russia also available for use as well. I do not know for absolute certain the production rate of these missiles, but I was told, I received an email some months ago which put the production rate at 25 missiles a month. Given the size and complexity of this system, that might be too high. But then again, the Russians have long experience in building ballistic missiles. Perhaps 25 a year might be a more realistic figure, but then I don't know that the 25 a month is wrong either. Let's assume that it is 25 a year. I'm being completely conservative here. Or even 12 a year, but let's stick with the figure of 25. Well, that means that the Russians can launch 2 missiles against Ukraine every month, or they can launch 1 missile against Ukraine every month with the kind of devastating effects that we saw last night, and they still have 12 or 13, and they can start gradually to build up a stockpile, which I presume is what they would want to do, because this is a system as much intended to counter NATO as it is to defeat Ukraine, and the Russians will want to have a stockpile of these missiles ready. So the Russians now are in a position, this is my point, to use the Oreshnik in the ongoing war that they are prosecuting in Ukraine. And given that it entered full service in December, I have to say that I was expecting that an attack would come probably this month. In fact, I seem to remember that I said as much in a program that I made a short time ago. So, this attack on the energy facility in western Ukraine is likely to be the first of many. We are not just going to have one Oreshnik strike. We're likely to have more and more, and it's likely that the production rate of this missile will grow, and it might very well be that over the course of 2026, the longer the war continues, the more Oreshniks will be used, and we could see eventually that whereas at the moment we have one strike a month, that might increase to 2, and then maybe to 4, and then more of them, causing even more devastation and damage to Ukraine over and above the damage that was done by this strike that happened last night. Now, there is considerable discussion about how effective, how much damage the Oreshnik actually does. Putin said that if several Oreshnik missiles were to attack a single target simultaneously, if in other words there was to be a group attack of these missiles, then the effect would be comparable to the detonation of a nuclear device. By the way, the fact that Putin said that strongly suggests to me that this is indeed the ultimate intention, and we could be seeing later on this year attacks on particular facilities in Ukraine against which more than one Oreshnik is used simultaneously. And, well, the effect of that, I don't even want to even begin to think about. There was also a lot of talk about the fact that the attack on the Yuzhmash plant, the big, sprawling industrial complex in Dnipro, which was the target of the first attack in November 2024, that the warheads that were used in that attack were inert. And I have pointed out that I've received what I consider to be extremely conclusive, very, very powerful evidence that, in fact, the attack, the warheads, the Oreshnik warheads, are intended to be launched using a new special explosive with detonation powers far greater than conventional explosive, made based on an adapted form of powdered aluminium. And I believe that to be the case, by the way. In fact, I have no doubt that it is the case. I don't for a certainty know that warheads of that kind were used against the factory in Yuzhmash. I don't know that warheads of that kind were used against the factory, the industrial complex, the gas complex that was attacked last night. But I strongly suspect that they were. And I'm going to cite why. Now, Yuzhmash, the factory that was attacked in November, has been a vital part of the Ukrainian and previously of the Soviet military-industrial complex. Yuzhmash is not, in fact, actually a single factory. It is an extraordinarily complex agglomeration of various workshops, and factories, with many of the more important components of this factory, of this factory complex, located in hardened shelters built by the Soviet Union underground. Yuzhmash used to build many of the Soviet Union's intercontinental ballistic missiles. It was an enormously important part of the Soviet military industrial complex. Well, it also played a role in developing Ukraine's missiles. For example, the Ukrainians had their own production line for the Tochka missile, and I believe that some of them, perhaps all of them, were built in Yuzhmash. And there were other missile projects that the Ukrainians also had. Well, since the November 2024 attack on the Yuzhmash factory, I have been scanning Russian reports provided by the Russian Ministry of Defense, for information about further Russian attacks on the Yuzhmash factory, such as might suggest that the factory was still functioning. And I came across only one. This is in over a year of sustained Russian missile and drone attacks across Ukraine. And the reference to an attack on the Yuzhmash factory was casual, and it suggested to me that it was an attack on one of the more outlying facilities of the complex, rather than the heart of the complex itself. Now, taken together, that suggests to me that the November strike, the November 2024 strike, was every bit as devastating as the Russians say, and that the Yuzhmash factory was in effect put out of action, or at least the more important parts of the Yuzhmash factory. I have noticed that since the attack, there's been no tours of the factory, no major tours of the factory by Western reporters, for example, in Ukraine. Photos and pictures of the factory have appeared, but they're mostly social media and Ukrainian pictures. Certainly the underground facilities have the nature of the underground facilities and the damage to them. There's never been any confirmation of what actually happened there. So, huge amount of damage, so it seems to me. And, well, if that is correct, and of course I'm making a deduction, I'm making an inference on the basis of an absence of reporting from Yuzhmash since the Oreshnik strike of November 2024. Well, if the damage was as great as I think, why would it not be at least as great in terms of the damage done to this gas reserve facility in Western Ukraine? Just saying. Now, there's a few further points that can be made about this too. Firstly, I have to say I've not seen any great plume of fire or anything of that kind. But would there actually be? I am not sure, especially if we're talking about gas held deep underground. Perhaps if the warheads were inert, the gas would have simply escaped into the atmosphere. These are speculations of mine, and I'm not the best person to make these speculations, so I'm not going to waste more time making them. But in my previous program, I mentioned that there was now a clear pattern of the Russians attacking American economic assets in Ukraine. There's been some pushback about this. People are saying that these are not particularly important assets and they're not connected to the US military industrial complex or the deep state. I beg to disagree very strongly. The Flex factory, which makes electronics, undoubtedly plays a role in supporting Ukraine's military effort. And I've no doubt that a company of that kind, a factory of that kind, which is American owned, is part of the military support for Ukraine. But perhaps even more important was the attack on the grain terminal in Odessa, which is a vital part of Ukraine's economic system. It's through that terminal that Ukraine's exports, grain exports, reach the world. And of course, if it is correct that there was a huge explosion there with a mushroom cloud, and I've no doubt that it is true, Larry Johnson, after all, has reported it, and he is a former intelligence analyst who used to work for the United States. Anyway, if that is true, then again, massive, devastating damage was done. Given that these are American-owned facilities, is there not at least a possibility that there were Americans there when these attacks took place? That there might have been Americans at the grain terminal in Odessa? If it is true that the gas reserves facility in Volva region, which has been attacked with this Oreshnik now, held natural gas also on behalf of Europe, might there have been Europeans there as well? People from Germany too. Now, the Ukrainians did have early warning of this attack, and the reason they did is because the Russians informed the United States in advance that this Oreshnik attack was coming. They gave warning about it several days ago, and this enabled the US Embassy in Kiev to publish a warning advising Westerners to stay away from important facilities because some major attack was pending. Now, if this warning was heeded, perhaps the European personnel who might have been at this facility, had the wisdom to stay away. But the fact remains that there would probably have been a high prospect that they had been there, and the Russians could not have known that they would no longer be there when the Oreshnik struck. Now, as to why the Russians gave this warning, again, I know there's going to be many people who will push back against this, but there is actually a very straightforward reason. The Oreshnik is a ballistic missile. This particular Oreshnik was launched apparently from the Kapustin Yar space center in central Russia. There are apparently intercontinental ballistic missiles that form part of Russia's strategic forces located in and around Kapustin Yar. There would have been a danger, if no prior warning was given to the United States, that the United States, noticing that a ballistic missile had been launched from Kapustin Yar, its satellites would have given the United States early warning of this fact. The United States might have been worried that this was an intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead, and well, we can imagine the enormous risks that might have resulted, the risks of extraordinary actions being taken if that had been the case. So it is basic precaution to give warning that an attack of this kind with Oreshnik was taking place. But of course the Russians, whilst informing the Americans that there would have been an attack with the Oreshnik, would not have disclosed the target. And it's obvious that the Ukrainians did not know what the target was going to be. So hopefully the warnings were heeded. The European personnel who might have been at this facility were perhaps no longer there when this strike came. There's been no reports of anybody being killed at this facility. Perhaps the Ukrainians were wise enough to evacuate also. And of course the strike happened at night. And it's important to say that as there is no ability to intercept the Oreshnik, its effectiveness does not increase because it is launched at night. Rather, launching it at night is clearly intended to reduce casualties, because by definition there are going to be fewer people at a facility that is attacked during the night than there would be during the day. Anyway, a dramatic escalation in the way that the Russians conduct the war, one which might have severe economic impacts on Europe, one which is certain to have significant economic impact on Ukraine itself. The mayor of Lvov is saying that boilers and heaters in the city of Lvov are barely able to operate anymore, and that the pressure from the gas has sunk to extremely low levels. We could be seeing soon a situation where Lvov is also out of power. And Klitschko has already told Ukrainian citizens of Kiev to evacuate. Well, might that not start to happen in other major cities as well? So, a cumulative crisis, and to repeat again, this is not the first occasion when an attack like this is going to take place. There are certain to be more Oreshniks launched against Ukraine over the course of this year, and probably the number of these that are going to be used is going to steadily increase over the course of the year, also with all of the effects and consequences that I've discussed. Now, I'm going to say something else which relates to the economic situation within Ukraine. We see devastating strikes taking place across Ukraine. We've seen much of Ukraine cut off from electric power. We hear about shortages of water, and we have the mayor of Kiev now advising people to leave the city. Manufacturing and industrial activity and economic activity in Ukraine must be coming increasingly to a stop. Odessa, the port, is now, even according to the American media, under effective blockade. It is no longer possible for ships to reach Odessa and leave Odessa in the confident knowledge that they will be left alone. So probably fewer and fewer ships will try. And of course, if they do come, the terminals from which they will be working are now themselves targets of Russian attack. So Odessa, as an economic center, is being closed down. So the Ukrainian economy, despite claims about GDP growth that you regularly see, despite all of those sort of claims, the reality must be that actual manufacturing and economic activity must be coming to a stop, a virtual stop. And yet, what do we see? The European Union still continues to send money into Ukraine. It has just agreed, it agreed last year, to provide Ukraine with another 90 billion euro loan, one which Ukraine will only repay when the Russians pay reparations. I've discussed this loan at enormous length. I'm not going to discuss it further in more detail in this program. A 90 billion euro infusion of money into an economy that is unable to function is an extraordinary thing. The money is supposedly going to be spent in Ukraine. It's going to provide salaries, pay salaries presumably, for Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian civil servants, and provide further funding, Zelensky says, for drone production and such things, and cover the gaping holes in the budget. And of course the Ukrainian government needs to pay pensions and other things. But what are the people who receive this money, assuming that they are going to receive this money? What are they going to spend it on? Of course, Ukraine imports many, many goods, but no economy can function, no economy the size of Ukraine's, no country the size of Ukraine's can function entirely without imports. But production of consumer goods, as of all other goods in Ukraine, will have come to a virtual stop. Perhaps we are not looking here so much as hyperinflation, because most of this money is going to go straight out of Ukraine again. The Ukrainians today are talking about transferring a part of their drone production to Poland. Whether Ukraine does indeed build any drones in Poland is questionable. If that is the plan, then it will no doubt take some time for drone production in Poland to get started properly. I have to say that to me, this looks like a rationalization, a justification, a cover story, if you prefer, for getting money that is coming into Ukraine out of Ukraine. You transfer money to various banks in the Baltic states and perhaps to Poland, and you say that you're doing it to produce drones in Poland, but the key thing is you've got the money out of Ukraine, you've got it abroad, and of course it may not stay in those banks in the Baltic states and in Poland for very long, and it might not translate into many drones produced in Poland either. I noticed that Donald Trump's first ever national security advisor, General Michael Flynn, has made comments about the fact that Zelensky himself is utterly corrupt, as is his entire team, and that Michael Flynn cannot understand why the United States continues to have any time for these people like Zelensky and the others. I don't disagree with Michael Flynn, and I have my own suspicions about setting up drone facilities in Ukraine, in Poland rather, and what that is really about. But suffice to say again, that if any money is coming into Ukraine from these loans, then it's more likely to stoke up inflation than achieve anything positive, because you will find money chasing goods which Ukraine itself is unable to produce anymore. And to the extent that Ukraine imports goods, of course, its current account will fall into ever deeper crisis, and sooner or later, inevitably, that is going to lead to further doubts about whether it is possible to go on giving Ukraine money, lending it money, as has been done up to now. There is another important fact about this attack with the Oreshnik, and that is that it is a massive display of power. At the recent meeting, which took place on the 5th and 6th of January in Paris, the Europeans, Macron and Starmer, again committed themselves to deploying troops to Ukraine and to setting up what they called hubs, military hubs there. There's a lot of people, by the way, who are coming out and saying that the word hubs does not mean military bases. The Russian Foreign Ministry, however, refuses to call these so-called hubs. It clearly calls them military bases. And I have to say, that is exactly what I suspect they are intended to be, what I am sure that they are intended to be. Anyway, Macron, in order to reassure people in France and elsewhere, gave an assurance that these troops, these European troops, would not be sent anywhere close to the front lines. They would be held back in western Ukraine. He was very vague, by the way, as to what exactly they were supposed to be doing so far from the front lines, especially if they were supposed to be monitoring some sort of ceasefire. Anyway, the point was he was trying to create the impression that by keeping them in western Ukraine, they would be out of harm's way. They are not out of harm's way. Lvov has up to now been mostly beyond the range of Russian missiles. The Iskander missiles cannot reach Lvov. They are ground-based ballistic missiles. They don't have the range from their launch points in Donbass and Zaporozhye to reach Lvov itself. Kinzhal missiles can do, but the Russians have been focusing them mostly in operations around Kiev and in central Ukraine. And besides, Kinzhal missiles are also in relatively short supply and are relatively expensive, and the Russians prefer to use them in quantities, 2 or 3 or 4 at a time, and it would probably be a stress on the stockpile and the production line to launch them against targets in Lvov. A single Kinzhal could do significant damage, and a Kinzhal that was launched against a training base in western Ukraine in early 2022 did massive damage. But, well, there would nonetheless be a limit to how much damage a single missile could do. The Russians can, of course, reach western Ukraine with their subsonic cruise missiles, the Kh-101s and the Calibres, and with drones. But the West Ukraine do have some defense against subsonic cruise missiles and drones. There is no defense to the Oreshnik. If the Europeans deploy forces to western Ukraine, the Russians can reach them. They can attack them with Oreshnik missiles, hypersonic missiles that fly at speeds that are greater than 10 times the speed of sound. The Oreshnik that was launched and used last night covered the distance between Kapustin Yar in central Russia and Lvov in 15 minutes. So the Russians can launch and strike at the Europeans with these exceptionally fast hypersonic missiles against which there is no defense. And of course these missiles are able to do the devastating damage that I have talked about. Macron may say that these troops would not be in harm's way, but they obviously would be. By the way, if the United States were to give a promise to act to defend these European troops in Western Ukraine, the answer that was given last night is that it can't. The United States itself has no capability to intercept, destroy, or interfere with an Oreshnik missile. The missile moves too fast, the warheads move too fast for the United States, with its present technologies, to be able to intercept them. So if the European troops in Western Ukraine were to be subjected to a sustained attack by Russia using Oreshnik missiles, the United States now knows that its only means to act on whatever backstop or guarantee it was giving, the only way it could do that would be by attacking the Russians themselves much further east in Donbass and Zaporozhye, and even that would not prevent strikes by Oreshnik missiles against Western troops in Western Ukraine. There would have to be attacks, strikes on Russian military facilities deep inside Russia. The difficulties of conducting that kind of operation would be enormous, even for the American military. And to say it straightforwardly, the risks that this would provoke an all-out war leading to the use of nuclear weapons, well, those kind of risks would increase to stratospheric levels. So this is a demonstration of enormous power and also of deterrence. It demonstrates to the United States, especially, and to the Europeans, if they were to listen to it, that any deployment of European forces in Western Ukraine would be not just reckless and misconceived, but potentially, in fact, probably catastrophic, given the warnings about such deployments that the Russians have already given. I cannot help but think that it was the Oreshnik strike, the latest Oreshnik strike, about which, by the way, the Germans probably also had prior warning. I said that the Russians apparently warned the United States 3 days before the Oreshnik strike took place, and the Americans, the United States, would have passed on that warning to the Ukrainians and to the NATO allies, including to the Germans. Anyway, this probably explains certain comments made by Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor. He says that he's made statements to the effect that foreign troops in Ukraine cannot be deployed without Russia's consent. And he said that this whole idea is far off. This simply does not work without the consent of Russia. The order should be as follows: first a ceasefire, then security guarantees for Ukraine as a condition for a long-term agreement with Russia. None of this is possible without Russia's consent, and we're probably still a long way from that. Anyway, that is what Merz has said. Macron and Starmer far too invested now in the coalition of the willing and the deployment of European troops to Ukraine to be able to say things like this. But Merz, who's not yet taken the plunge, is able to say this. The Russians have a veto, and they've just demonstrated with the use of the Oreshnik against Western Ukraine. Why? Anyway, this attack with the Oreshnik, devastating as it was, and demonstrating very much the developing situation in the war, comes alongside further information about Russian advances. Now, there's very complex fighting going on west of Kupiansk, which I'm not going to be discussed further in this program. There's still a lot of confusion about the situation, but the Russian military does seem to be operating well to the west of Kupiansk. Some are speculating that the Russians are in the process of conducting some other kind of encirclement operation of Ukrainian troops who have been trying to break into Kupiansk, or who have actually broken into Kupiansk, if you believe what the Ukrainians are saying. Now, perhaps the most dramatic news over the last 24 hours on the battlefronts is actually coming from the Lyman area, a little to the south of Kupiansk. There is now apparently video footage which does finally confirm the presence of Russian troops, if not in Lyman itself, at any rate in the outskirts of Lyman, in the suburbs of Lyman, suggesting that Lyman is indeed being stormed. But perhaps more interesting is news that somewhat to the north of Lyman, the Russians appear to be operating in the area of the Svyatogorsk forest and appear to be preparing to capture a small but important town, culturally important town, called Svyatogorsk, which, by the way, also contains nearby an important Orthodox monastery. Now, Svyatogorsk, as well as its cultural importance, was a place that the Russians briefly controlled in 2022. And its importance is that it lies very close to the MO3 road. Now, if you go to a map of the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk part of Donbass, you quickly see that after the fall of Pokrovsk, there are basically only two big roads leading into Slavyansk, Kramatorsk. One is a road that comes to Kramatorsk from the west, passing through a town called Alexandrivka. Now, this road is Alexandrivka itself, which is, as I said, the place through which this road passes, is the northernmost of a cluster of towns in this very same area, which start with Pokrovsk itself and which continue through Rodinske, Dobropilye, Rodinske, Belitskaya, Dobropilye, Bilozerske, Novodonetske, and then the northernmost one is Alexandrivka. The Russians are in control of Pakrovsk and Rodinska. There are reports that they are attacking Belitskaya and that they're preparing to storm Belitskaya. Dobropilia will presumably be next. That would then put the Russians in a position to capture the three small towns that lie immediately to the north along this road: Bilozerska, Novodonetska, and Alexandrivka. At which point, the road to Kramatorsk from the west is cut. Now, that would then leave only the road from the north, the MO3 road, the one that passes close to Svyatogorsk. It lies just west of Svyatogorsk. Now, if Svyatogorsk is captured, the Russians are in a position to basically cut supplies along that road. They would probably not want to occupy the road itself, but their drones could easily reach the road from Svyatogorsk, as could their mortars and artillery. Now, I don't think the Russians would stop at Svyatogorsk. To the north of Svyatogorsk is the important town of Izium. Izium, a little bit like Siversk, is located on higher ground. The Russians would probably want to capture Izium, which they also held briefly in 2022. But the point is that just as the fall of these places, Dobropilia, Bilozerska, Novodonetska, and Alexandrivka itself, would cut off supplies to the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation from the west, so the capture of Svyatogorsk, Lyman, and Izium will cut off supplies to Slavyansk-Kramatorsk from the north. A cauldron is forming, a cauldron around Slavyansk-Kramatorsk. We are moving closer and closer and faster to that point. The Russians have taken all the key pieces to the south and east. Siversk, for example, Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar. They're in the process of capturing Konstantinovka and Druzhivka, and one can see that the cauldron around Slavyansk-Kramatorsk is developing. And of course, all of this is happening even as the Russians continue to grind forward remorselessly in the south, in Zaporozhye region, towards the city of Zaporozhye, and even as Ukraine continues to be plunged in darkness and left without heating, electricity, and water, obliging the Ukrainian authorities increasingly to evacuate people from the cities. There continues to be this illusion held by many people in the West that the war continues to be in some sort of stalemate. What sort of stalemate these people are seeing, I cannot fathom. There is an article, a bizarre article, one of many that he writes, by Ambrose Evans Pritchard in the Daily Telegraph, in which he spoke of the Russians advancing just 50 meters a day. It's absolutely not 50 meters a day. What I suspect he's doing, like many other people are doing, is that he's taking his information probably from the Institute of the Study of War and from the Ukrainians. Everybody who follows the war closely knows that their maps are far out of date, that they don't reflect the actual changes on the battlefronts. At best, often they show huge grey zone territories in the grey zone, which most people who follow the war more closely can definitely see that the Russians have captured. And anyway, putting aside all of that, with a Ukraine largely plunged in darkness, with economic activity having effectively ended, with export from Odessa no longer possible, I do wonder how anybody can see a viable continuation, long-term continuation of the war in this critical, indeed catastrophic situation. Anyway, I started this program by talking about Russian responses to American provocations. And over the course of the last 24 hours, we've had further interesting information about the Marinera or Bella 1 tanker, the whole episode involving that tanker. There's been a very interesting article on Unheard by Jennifer Kavanagh, and, well, more and more people are in fact now confirming that there were in fact Russian warships heading towards the Marinera, let's call it the Marinera, rather than the Bella 1, though they didn't actually reach it. That's my understanding, and that's what I'm seeing, reading and seeing, and it seems to have been confirmed. One of the people, by the way, who's also confirmed that Russian warships were moving in that area was Donald Trump. But of course, I don't intend to take what he says especially seriously, because other things he says about this incident, as we will see shortly, almost certainly, in fact definitely, are not true. Anyway, my point about this incident, which I've made over the last 2 days, is that the tanker itself was, shall we say, had a huge question mark over it. It was flying under the Guyana flag. There were uncertainties about its ownership. 2 members of the crew, just 2 members of the crew, as it turns out, were Russian. And we'll come to them in a moment. And yet, the ship owner, whoever he was, in order to try to save the tanker, and perhaps the crew also, painted the Russian flag on the hull, and there was an attempt to re-register the ship on the maritime register in the Russian city of Sochi. The Americans nonetheless went ahead and seized it. They didn't recognize the Russian ownership. They claimed that the tanker was involved in illicit activities involving Venezuela and Iran. Now, it seems to me, and by the way, Jennifer Kavanagh on Unheard has made essentially the same point, that the United States pursued a rusting old tanker, empty tanker, across the Atlantic, whose actual ownership was in doubt, and of course managed to capture it, but has, other than doing that, certainly in geopolitical terms, achieved absolutely nothing. Whereas the Russians, for their part, seem to have decided and determined that this provided them with the opportunity to make absolutely clear that they would act to defend and protect their shipping on the high seas. And, well, just a few hours after the ship was seized, just a few hours after, the United States repeated that this was not really seen as a Russian ship, that it was entirely trading oil from Venezuela and Iran and was flying a false flag. After all of that, but after the United States said that the crew, who were mainly Ukrainian, the actual breakdown of the nationalities of the crew were 17 Ukrainians, 3 Indians, 6 Georgians, and 2 Russians. Anyway, after saying that they would prosecute the crew for engaging in criminal activities, this morning the United States released the 2 members of the crew who were Russians. Now, it seems to me that the Russians have made their point, and the United States is signaling that it has heeded that message. More and more ships that trade with Russia are registering properly on the Russian Merchant Navy register. More and more of them are transitioning to the Russian flag. The Russians have made their point that they're prepared to deploy warships to defend their ships, and they've also demanded that the United States treat the 2 Russian crew members properly, and we see that the United States has in fact released them. So it seems to me that not only did the Russians make their point, but that the Americans have accepted it. The Americans have an old, rusting, empty tanker. The Russians have their crew members back, and they've demonstrated conclusively that they will defend ships that legally fly the Russian flag and which operate on the high seas. As far as I can see, and I defy anybody to argue otherwise, the Russians have come out clearly ahead on points in this matter. In fact, I understand that in Britain now, after the initial excitement about helping the Americans to seize the Marinera, well, according to the London Times, there are now serious worries that the Russians are going to take countermeasures against British-flagged ships. So, after the initial excitement, there is now the worry and the doubt. And I've also been reading explanations in the media in Britain that basically ships that fly flags and which are properly registered in countries are trading legally and really cannot be interfered with on the high seas. So it seems to me that there is a major reverse taking place there. If there was a plan to start seizing Russian tankers that trade with Russia on the high seas, the Russians have taken action, and this has, at least for the moment, caused not just a pause, but a retreat. That this is so is confirmed, as far as I'm concerned, by rather blustering comments from Trump, talking about how this was a Russian ship, how it was filled with oil. We know that it was not, how the Russian warships that were there to defend it didn't defend it. But as I said, other sources say they hadn't even reached the scene yet. The fact that Trump is having to bluster in this way makes me sense that he is indeed trying to cover for a retreat that he has been obliged to make. Anyway, that's the situation in the war at the moment. Now, Zelensky is talking about going to the United States next week in order to finalize the security guarantees. But we've just seen that Merz is saying that the security guarantees must be agreed by the Russians, and they show no sign or intention of agreeing to do that. So whatever discussion takes place between Trump and Zelensky next week is now purely hypothetical, because even if Trump says that he is indeed prepared to give some kind of security guarantees, they cannot be effective because the Russians have a veto over them. Merz has just admitted as much. And of course, as I said earlier in the program, the Russians have demonstrated that they have a power to make their veto effective and to attack European forces in western Ukraine with devastating force and in a way that the United States cannot counter. So, Trump has given a long interview to the New York Times. He's somewhat downplayed the whole idea of security guarantees. He was very vague about the formula. He said that it would be up to the Europeans to do the hard work. He didn't explain what the United States actually intends to do. There is some talk, there are some reports that Dmitriev had met with Witkoff and Kushner in Paris, and that Witkoff and Kushner gave him an update on what has been discussed with the Europeans. But if that is so, we had that very forceful statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry yesterday, which I discussed in my program yesterday, in which the Russians made it absolutely clear that they reject the entire set of proposals that came out of the Paris meeting outright, that they insist on a non-aligned, neutral, disarmed, denazified Ukraine, one which accepts the current territorial realities and restores fully the rights of the Russian Orthodox Church and of Russian speakers in Ukraine. In other words, Istanbul plus. And as I said, if Witkoff and Kushner did pass on to Dmitriev the proposals that were discussed in Paris, the Russians have already said that they've rejected them as soon, presumably, as they received them from Dmitriev. So when Zelensky meets Trump next week, if he does meet Trump next week, he's going to find that Trump is saying no. Or if he is saying yes, Trump will be saying yes against, say yes to a plan which the Russians have already rejected. And we've seen that the United States, for the moment, is backing off the idea of seizing Russian ships on the high seas. Enabling Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian ships is one thing. You can put all the blame on the Ukrainians, even though it makes the Russians furious and is likely to lead to naval escorts being provided. But the United States is drawing back from an outright confrontation with the Russians on the high seas. Anyway, that's for the moment. That may explain why there is once again this sudden enthusiasm in Washington for Lindsey Graham's and Richard Blumenthal's bone-crushing sanctions. Because the war in Ukraine is being lost. Trump is not willing to make any further direct investment in the war. He conspicuously told the New York Times that he is not providing Ukraine with, he made no further definite commitments of aid to Ukraine while the war is underway. And as I've discussed in many programs now, the Europeans are not in a position by themselves to make those commitments either. So the United States can see that the war is being lost. It has already imposed massive sanctions against Russia, going all the way back to 2014, and they haven't worked. If there were intentions to try to bribe the Russians with offers of economic cooperation to get them to stop, well, the Russians aren't taking the bait. And for the moment at least, the idea of trying to choke off Russia's energy exports by seizing tankers on the high seas, that seems to have been put on the back burner. So we're back to the bone-crushing sanctions. Trump himself, however, has his doubts. He says that, yes, he is prepared to support the bill and that he does expect this bill to come into force, but he hopes that he will never have to put it into action. And why? One can see why. Because the only way this can possibly work is if the United States places massive tariffs on China to get China to stop buying Russian oil, probably India too. And, well, we've seen that China has devastating economic leverage. It would almost certainly use in that case in response. It would stop exports of rare earths and probably also supplies of other electronic goods and things of that kind, and that would have a devastating effect on the industrial situation in the United States. So there we are. We are in a situation where the war goes on, the Russians advance, the United States is having to face increasingly the fact that it has no leverage. And I'm going to suggest that one of the reasons for these extraordinary actions that we've seen from the United States, the utter disregard for international law, the kidnapping of Maduro, the threats being made against all kinds of countries, the threats being made against Iran, the demands for Greenland, and all of that. One of the reasons why all of these things are happening is because against the two countries which really matter, America's adversaries, China and Russia, the United States is discovering that its leverage is very limited indeed. The French scholar Emmanuel Todd spoke way back in the early 2000s of how the United States resorts to micro-militarism, performances of micro-militarism against weak countries, because it can't really go head to head with the strong ones. And isn't that exactly what we have seen in Venezuela? Perhaps before long also in Iran. Now, I haven't discussed much the latest protests in Iran in recent programs. I don't know what the internal situation is in Iran. There is certainly lots of footage of protests in Iran, but the Iranian authorities themselves are claiming that some of this footage is recycled footage from earlier protests. They still say or imply that they have the situation fully under control and that the protests themselves, though becoming increasingly violent in places, are not actually particularly big. There has been earlier this morning a defiance speech from the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, saying that the protesters are basically aligning themselves with Trump, with the United States, and with Israel. All of which strongly suggests to me that a crackdown has probably been ordered, and that probably explains the internet cut-off, which, by the way, the Iranian authorities have practiced before when there's been other protests. Protests are not that rare in Iran. There are plenty of reasons for them. The economy in Iran is indeed under extreme stress. Inflation is indeed extremely high. There have been problems with a water shortage, and there is, in my opinion, ample proof of significant economic mismanagement, and I'm being polite about it. So there's plenty of reasons why people would protest, and I suspect that there are, well, I've no doubt that there are serious protests going on. For the moment, I retain the view that I don't think that these will lead to the collapse of the entire political system in Iran. President Trump today is also saying that Ayatollah Khamenei is about to flee to Moscow, or at least he's prepared to flee. There was a similar claim made a few days ago by the London Times, and there was a similar claim, there's been similar claims repeated by many people. I've seen absolutely no evidence of this. On the contrary, as I said, he was there at Friday prayers, making admittedly short but nonetheless defiant speeches whilst he was with his supporters. So I don't myself think that the system is about to collapse. I get the sense that the security forces are certainly strong enough to control the situation, and that the existing government does have still sufficient legitimacy and authority in the country in order to be able to retain control of the situation. I will say this, however, though overall I am sure that the government will retain control. I am not totally sure. And the reason is that it does seem to me that over the last year, the government in Iran, in some respects, has not been working effectively. President Pezeshkian launched into unprepared reforms. I'm talking now singling out his economic reforms, which created instability in the currency and which have increased the pressures. And this comes on top of a long history of economic mismanagement in Iran, which certainly precedes President Pezeshkian. So, inevitably, this is going to create doubts within Iran about the effectiveness of the government and will lead to a loss of support. And I do get the sense that there is more disillusion with the government now than there has been during previous periods of protest. So obviously the situation has to be watched. I'm not going to say more about it now. If the situation develops rapidly and if things do get out of control in Iran, which, to repeat again, I don't expect, then I will obviously have to cover it. I expect, on the contrary, that over the next couple of days, more likely than not, the situation will be brought under control. For the record, the information I got about the true size of the protests some days ago suggested that they were actually dwindling rather than growing. I would repeat again that the Iranian authorities themselves say that some of the footage of the protests that is being circulated is of earlier protests, not of the existing ones. I can't confirm that. Impossible for me to. But anyway, that's for the future. In the meantime, the Oreshnik is the story. The use of the Oreshnik is the story of this program. Today, I will clearly be discussing this further, but this is where I end today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.